host, David, here, and I'm very thrilled and honored to be joined by Liz Olivia Fernandez, who is a journalist from Cuba, to talk about her recent documentary project. Thank you so much for joining us on Left Reckoning.
It's a pleasure to be here.
Well, I mean, I want to talk a little bit about these documentaries specifically, but one of the main topics and very important thing whenever we're talking about Cuba is the U.S. sanctions on the island. And before we get into maybe talking about the American side, some of the figures behind it who are advocating for it, I was wondering if you could sort of paint a picture for our listeners about what the sanctions mean for everyday Cuban people on a kind of daily level.
That's interesting because here in Cuba, we don't think about the sanctions and what is the impact that the sanctions have in our entire life. But for example, because I don't want to talk about all the Cubans because all Cubans have their own experience with the sanctions, depend of race, gender, local, like a geographical situation, if you will live in the city or in rural areas. Because sanctions affect us, but it's not the same for everybody. Depends on who you are. So for me, sanctions right now means doesn't have any friends living here, doesn't have any community support here because most of the people like from of my age they left Cuba in the last 3 years. And that's really painful because Cuba is a country that's getting older faster. We are an island, so we are isolated and ready for the rest of the world. So imagine if the young people who live in Cuba, the young Cubans, are leaving Cuba because they couldn't find opportunities here. Because we are not talking just about scarcities, because we have been experiencing sanctions for more than almost 60 years now, from the 60. For the 62 until now, it's more than 60 years now. So we haven't learned how to live with the scarcity, but since 2019 till now, the situation is getting worse and worse. During 2019, I remember about the oil shortages, Trump getting elected in 2016, and in some point in 2017 he started talking about Cuba issues, and it was a really turning point because at the beginning when he was in his campaign he was talking about doing business with Cuba, normalized relation with Cuba, but in some point he just stopped by Florida, and once the person who was his against Trump was Marco Rubio. At the time, he was trying to run for Republican candidate as a Republican candidate against Trump, became an ally because Trump was becoming at that time the candidate for the Republican Party. So Marco Rubio became an ally, and he understood at some point that he had to have Florida in his corner. So he changed completely the point of view about Cuba, and he started talking about sanctions and regime change, human rights violation, and so on. This is the same speech that every U.S. citizen, I'm pretty sure that I haven't listened to about when they talk about Cuba. And this is something that they use in their own convenience. Because I always talk about, okay, human rights violation. This is because I say, okay, the sanctions is because Cuba is a regime that is committing human rights violations. So our response is more sanctions to Cuba. And I always say, okay, how these sanctions are helping to improve the human rights violations in Cuba. And why you just apply sanctions in Cuba, you don't apply sanctions in other countries around the world. Don't talk about Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Israel, so on. Let's talk about Latin America. Colombia, Salvador, Honduras. Let's talk about him. So what's going on? Why Cuba? So this is only the excuse, but they don't are talking seriously and they don't care about human rights violations because it's the same people that in United States are defending, for example, when they have protesters or demonstrations about social justice, and they say, okay, we have to repress them. Okay, let's talk about repression. Let's go to repress them because they are getting violent and they are asking for social justice. They are talking about demonstration in black people, talking about racial equality in the United States. So all of this get into they're just excuses that the United States used to put sanctions on my country to like they're pushing harder and harder.
Well,
Um,
so I actually wanted to ask you a little bit about this because one of the things I think is and it's very notable about the way that there's this push to continue the sanctions. First of all, under Trump, but now under Biden, who seems very uninterested in really addressing this issue. I wanted to talk about him in a second, but before that, what is it that the main organizations that are pushing for sanctions, pushing for isolation on Cuba, hoping to achieve here? Because there's an aspect to it where I'm against sanctions in general. But just if you were to take their own logic that we'll put sanctions on Cuba so that maybe the people will rise up and do whatever, it very clearly hasn't resulted in that in Cuba. All that has happened is it's caused suffering and pain for the Cuban people, but it hasn't created the conditions where the Cuban government is going to collapse. So continuing these sanctions doesn't seem like really a strategy to embolden people or anything like that, but rather to punish generations of human beings. I mean, I'm curious, what it is that you think that these groups really expect. Do you think that they still believe this idea that the sanctions on Cuba are going to, cause the end of the the current government of Cuba?
Well, I can respond for them. This is a question. This would be a really good question for administrations in general from the United States, because sanctions is not just about Republican Party; it's also Democrat Party who support the sanctions in different states. So I don't know. I think that many of them maybe but this is not the only thing. Like the entire proposed goal of the sanctions is Cuban government to collapse. They are waiting for that. They are pushing for that. But they know about the suffering of the people. They know that the sanctions is affecting more to the people, to the government. But they don't care about that. And that's really something that I wasn't expecting. Like I was suspected, like they don't care about the people, but I didn't know for sure.
So you were saying, one of the things that was sort of shocking to you when you came to the U.S. was, actually hearing and sort of digging into some of the perspectives of some of the organizations that are very hard advocates for the sanctions on Cuba. Could you talk a little bit about that experience?
Yeah, I think this in general is like, because at the beginning I have this idea about, okay, they don't understand what is going on in Cuba. They don't understand how the sanctions is affecting to the working class people, to the families in Cuba. So, okay, I was with this idea that maybe they were confused about what's going on with the sanctions and the effects that the sanctions actually have in Cuba people, because this is not an information that you can find in mainstream media outlets in the United States. This is they're running when they have to cover in some small, medium, big protests in Cuba. Or they talk about press freedom, or they talk about human rights abuses, but they don't cover positive stories about the Cuba, or they don't cover in sanctions at all. Or what is the effect that the sanctions has on Cuban people and the population in general. They just talk about how the sanctions is affecting to the government. And that's not true. But if it wasn't true, you have to, of course, if you know Cuba, if you have put in a foot in Cuba, you understand that the majority of people in Cuba work for the government. And the majority of people in Cuba who work for the government, the majority of them are Black people, Black family. So it's just domino effects. If you're affecting to the government, if you're affecting public sector, you're affecting the majority of people in Cuba directly, just without doing math or calculations. It's something that you can really notice. And you are affecting a population in Cuba is already marginalized. So it's easy to understand. But it was okay, they don't know about that. Maybe they know, but they know. They actually know. Obama, 2014, when they were in Cuba, they say, okay, this is not working because this is affecting justice to the people that are still not affecting with the government. So the goal was the same. We are trying to overthrow Cuban government, but let's try a different tactic. Let's try to bring to Cuba investment, private sector. Let's try to empower them, and let's change the rules of the game. And that was Obama's strategy. That was great for Cuba because for the first time in my 30 years of life, I actually see a different Cuba. I actually see how people in Cuba was engaged for being in Cuba. The numbers of migration at the time was the lowest because everybody was talking about how Cubans leave Cuba to the United States because they are fleeing from communism, whatever, all the kind of things that they say, but they never say that, for example, the migration numbers to Cuban people from Dominicans are the same until 2019. It was the same. The same number of Cubans was leaving their own country to get to the United States. It was the same number that Dominicans were leaving DR to get into the United States until 2019. And nobody was talking about that. Of course, Cubans are fleeing from communism. Dominicans are fleeing from what? But this is a different conversation. So this is a different conversation that we have to get in some point and to visualize because they don't talk about numbers and what this number means to them in general in a context like Latin America. At the time, everybody was engaged because for the first time, and we have it in the War in Cuba with the interview with this entrepreneur, Idania, she told us this is the first time that I don't have to leave. I don't have. Because migration is hard. Nobody leaves their own country because, okay, let's try something different. Migration is hard. So she said, this is the first time in my entire life that I don't have to leave my country. I can stay here. I can build something, a business, whatever. So young people saw that they have opportunities inside their own country. Nobody said that it was easy. Nobody said that they're going to have obstacles, whatever. But for the first time, they saw the opportunity to do something different. That was in 2009. 15, 16, and 17 and 18 was the best years, I think so, until Trump came to the power and everything changed. But now it's pretty difficult because Cuba is not perfect. We have a lot of work to do here, but when you want to fix something, you have to fight for it. But because something that you can manage with, this is something you can fight for. But when your entire life, your future depends on foreign country, foreign government, something that you can reach, it's impossible for people like me to think like we can change our future. We can change my family life because I don't have nothing to do here. There's nothing that I can do in order to change that. That's why for me sometimes it's so hairless to do this kind of work because I felt really bad in my first trip to the United States because I was really frustrated, really angry because I get it. These people get it. They know they're affecting to the people, but they don't care. but they
Mhm.
don't care.
So, so I mean, on that, I mean, let's put some, let's direct folks. I mean, what are the major organizations and figures that are advocating for, the sanctions regime on Cuba? And also, just I assume there's a decent amount of that comes from the kind of like Miami, Florida connection, but also there are groups all across the country that are basically advocating for this. Correct?
Well, for me, well, there is a lot of Cuban Americans organizations that are pushing for
Hmm.
overthrow Cuban government, sanctions, terrorist list, and Cuba put Cuba in the state sponsor of terrorism list and so on. But because this is a Cuban American lobby that it was really powerful in the 70s and the 80s, but now they
Hmm.
don't need that lobby because they
Hmm.
became themselves powerful people that have key positions inside of US government.
Hmm.
We're talking about not just about in the Senate, they also have people in the camera, and they have like people put in different key positions that they really can hurt the Cuba US relations. They are a pretty small group, but they are pretty powerful. For example, in the Biden administration, because this is not only a Republican thing, it's also a Democrat thing. We can see Bob Menendez that became really infamous for this past month, but he was really famous for other reasons during the Biden administration because he became the person. He was the head of the Senate of the committee for the um, international affairs in the Senate of the United States. He became in the. I'm not saying that he is the only reason. He's not the only obstacle uh,
Hmm.
between U.S.-Cuba relationships. But for me, in my experience, he's the biggest single reason in why
Hmm.
Cuba and U.S. relations have been improved, even when Biden was part of the Obama administration where the normalization was happening. What the first lady was visiting Cuba as part of Obama delegation to 2016 when they come to Cuba. So
Hmm.
a lot of things will happen, and you will think, okay, this person knows what's going on. This person
Hmm.
has experienced this, so why is not doing nothing in order to help to Cuba? Some of the people think like, okay, he's waiting for a second term, if there is a second term for Biden
Hmm.
administration.
Which is a big question. Um, and I mean, but and there's an aspect to I'm not going to put you in the position of sort of guessing why Biden is acting the way that he is. But there is like one thing that's been, I think, very surprising about Biden politically is that some of the things from the Obama administration, like trying to normalize relations with Cuba, or trying to normalize relations with Iran. Joe Biden has shown very little interest in sort of reviving those policies that, yeah, Trump, haphazardly um, slashed. But I'm curious. Like while you were in your reporting, and then I'd like to talk a little bit more about the documentaries in particular. But
Mhm.
during your reporting, I mean, what was your sense? So, for example, of some of these kind of countervailing forces, maybe within the Democratic Party, to start trying to challenge this. I know, for example, my local congressperson here, Greg Casar, has been somebody who has called for the end to the sanctions many times since he's been in Congress. But I'm curious, during your reporting, what your sense was about, certain kind of attempts to push and pressure the Democratic Party and the Biden administration to stop these monstrous sanctions on the Cuban people.
Are you asking me about the people in general in Congress?
No, well, I'm just saying when in your reporting, how how much of a kind of challenge to the sanctions were you seeing? I mean, were you seeing anything of note, or anything that you found significant? Anything that maybe people should pay attention to, support?
Okay, I think the for me, it's the most of the people are afraid to make a statement about Cuba, because Cuba is a really polarized topic in the United States. It's like, and this is something that we talk about a lot during my visit, and my partner was talking about, okay, is this because in the United States they have something about the perfect victim? So if you are not a perfect victim, we can take position for you. We can back you. So that's why even when people like senators and congressmen and congresswomen talking positive, and they have a lot of positive things to say about Cuba, they say at the beginning of everything, they say, okay, we oppose to human rights violations. So they kind of agree with the narrative in the United States mainstream media. And after that, say, okay, and also we are against the sanctions, blah, 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 blah. But if the people don't take longer, don't pay, like, they don't stay too much time to they finish the whole thing. So they just get lost at the beginning, because they're used to hear the kind of a narrative, and they kind of highlight the topics, because it's like, I don't know. And this is something that I notice about U.S. audience in general. If you're talking 20 positive things about someone else, and you say something negative, and U.S. audience, the most of them are just keeping the negative. They just forget about the 20 positive things you already said about this person, about this thing. So it's really complicated, because it's too risky and politically talking. And the other thing that for me is a problem in the United States, you're always an election is coming. So you have to take care of your words when you talk about Cuba, because always an election is coming, so it's not convenient for me to take a position for Cuba. For example, something some evident, like Cuba being in a list of the countries that supposedly, because the United States said, support terrorism. That's insane. Because Cuba is the main ally. Because the United States, they say this, the State Department said it, and they have the entire document who say it, is the main ally, in Latin America in order to help the United States to fight against terrorism. They have a meeting about counterterrorism in the region with Cuba. At the same time, they put in a list that they say they support terrorism. How is it possible that you're getting agreements and cooperation deals for someone to help you to fight terrorism, at the same time you're naming that person terrorist? That doesn't have any sense. And nobody's talking about that. Nobody's questioning that. What is the arguments that they give that Cuba actually supports terrorism? Where?
I mean, it's something that's quite striking, and and I know in your work too, is like you try to ask American officials about why it is that Cuba is designated as a terror state, and they refuse to answer. Which just not to be starry-eyed here, but as somebody who lives in this country, it's really shocking to see the government basically saying, "Hey, we're making these decisions that have massive consequences for people, but we're also not really going to spend a lot of time trying to justify them, other than some kind of vague notion that this is a state sponsor of terror."
Exactly. And also because what does it mean for us? What does it mean for Cuba? If for us it was already difficult to try to have access to credit or have normal relations with the rest of the world, now imagine if you have to face the cost for someone, enterprise, businessman, business person who wants to do deals with Cuba. The risk is too high, because they're going to facing more sanctions and fines for the United States, because they have deals with Cuba. They can be sued for having deals with Cuba. But now, if we are on a list that they say that we are terrorists, who is going to do business with us? Who is going to put them in a risk in order to make business with us? We know how the war work. It's about money. It's about the profits that I can make. It's not about the race that I can be sanctioned for one of the most powerful country around the world. It's the United States we're dealing. It's the United States who are talking about. It's not Tubutu or another island in the Caribbean that say, okay, you can do business with this country because it means that you can do business with us. It's the United States.
Mm-hmm.
Now, for European citizens, just because we are in the terrorist list and they can travel to the United States on their ESTA visa. Now, since that means that Europeans who has been visiting Cuba, and this has a retroactive character too, that means that they can visit to the United States freely. Now they need a visa. You can ask in Europeans that are used to travel around the world without asking any visa, that now if they visit Cuba, they need to ask a visa in the United States. Maybe they have business in the United States. Maybe they have academic issues in the United States, friends, family, tourism. And now they need a visa and they need to wait for an appointment that maybe took 6 months. Is now they're trying to suffocate every space that we are trying to gain in order to kill us. It is a process that is slow and it has been taking more than 60 years now, but it's working. They're trying to isolate Cuba the every way imaginable.
Well, I think that these documentaries that they put out, really speak and are very educating on this issue. I was wondering, in the last couple of minutes, if you could, tell people where that they can find them, and engage with them and share this work.
Of course, we already shot last year 2 new documentaries. The first one is Uphill on the Hill, is in trying to figure out what is going on inside of the Biden administration about Cuba policy. And the second one is Hardliner on the Hudson, that is focuses in Bob Menendez and the influence that Bob Menendez has Biden administration, and also all the corruption scandal on the character himself of Bob Menendez and the community of Cuban Americans in New Jersey. So if you want to watch that documentaries, you need to subscribe to Belly of the Beast Cuba YouTube channel, because these 2 new documentaries is going to be released in the coming month of May. So be in touch. Stay tuned.
Well, we'll definitely put... No, absolutely. And we'll definitely put links below so that people can find that and subscribe and check out these documentaries. They're very, very well done and very worth your time. I really have to say, thank you so much, for taking the time to speak with me and finding a way to speak with me, because they don't make it easy either. But I do appreciate it so much.
It was an honor. I really enjoyed this conversation.
Thank you.